Good evening, everybody. This is Roger Williams. Welcome to History Author Talks. And I see that we've got a lot of our regulars joining us this evening. I'm very pleased about that. I will tell you right up front, I picked up a cold over the weekend. Nothing nefarious. I'm totally vaccinated and everything. But it was freezing cold this weekend, and I was giving a tour, and I wasn't wearing enough clothes. So I'm got a bit of a cold tonight, so my apologies for that. I wanted to first let everybody know as we are heading into the fall season here, the holiday season, as it were. This is also my busy season as a public historian. My partner and I start to give tours of the battles of Washington Crossing and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. This weekend, I am going to be attending in Mount Vernon the Congress of the American Revolutionary War Roundtables, where I'm going to be meeting up with a lot of like-minded, wonderful historians and getting a tour of Mount Vernon. And I also have some reenactments and wreath layings, so it's a busy time in my history world. But we are going to continue with History Author Talks. I've got shows lined up into February, so be sure to go to historyauthortalks.com and look and see what we've got coming up. For tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Paul Lockhart. Paul was one of our guest hosts on an earlier program of History Author Talks. He's a very good history, is a history professor at Wright State University, where he's taught military and European history for 31 years. Paul is the author of 6 books, well, actually 7 books, including the one he's going to be talking about tonight, on the role of war in history throughout the world, including Drill Master of Valley Forge and The Whites of Their Eyes. Paul lives in Dayton, Ohio, and you can find more information about Paul at his website, which is just very simply paullockhart.com. That's PAULLOCKHART.com. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Paul Lockhart, and we'll have him start to talk as soon as I can find him. He disappeared. There he is. He disappeared on my screen here. So there we go. Paul, welcome to History Author Talks.
Well, thanks, Roger. Thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure.
Well, it's great. And before we get started, Paul, tell us a little bit about some of your earlier books. As you know, I'm a big fan, and I'd love for our audience to hear about some of your earlier work.
Sure thing. Well, I won't say it's a mixed bag, but I've gone in a couple of different directions during my career. I started out, as a lot of academic historians do, started out as a Civil War buff and kind of moved from there. And as a graduate student working in military history with the late great Gunther Rothenberg, I moved across the Atlantic and back a few centuries. So my first 4 books actually deal with Scandinavia during the so-called Age of Greatness, basically from the Protestant Reformation to the middle end of the 17th century, and specifically with Denmark. So I've 2 books on Denmark's role in the wars of religion, a survey history of Denmark during this period, a survey history of Sweden during this period. And then I made kind of a break. And it's not that I've given up on Scandinavian history. It's just that the audience for it was very limited, and I really wanted to write for a bigger audience. And hence the 2 books I did on the Revolution. First, of course, Drill Master of Valley Forge, which came out something like 13 years ago now. And then my book on Bunker Hill, The Whites of Their Eyes. Both of which what I tried to do with those was to use the same standards of research and scholarship that I did in my academic works that were published by university presses, but focus obviously on the narrative with the intention of having, attracting obviously a broader readership than I would get with writing about 17th century Denmark. So with Firepower, Whites of Their Eyes came out in 2011, and been a 10-year hiatus with a lot of dead ends and ideas that didn't really go anywhere until I started working on Firepower.
So with Firepower, Firepower is unlike your earlier works, which were much more specific. This is a world history view of weaponry through the ages. Tell us where you came up with Firepower, and how long have you been thinking about it, and how it came to pass?
Been thinking about it a long time, and it is this is by far the most challenging, the hardest book I've ever written, and not because of the subject matter. It's the subject matter it's something I've studied for basically my entire adult life and good part of my childhood as well. It's the nature of the book. The fact that it is, as you mentioned, big. Not just long. I mean, it's twice as long as anything I've written before, very close to it. And one of the very first reviewers of the book kept pointing this out. He liked the book, but he kind of must have mentioned 6 times in his review that the book was long. And it is. I understand that. But the most of my previous books, of course, were heavily based in archival research, required maybe weeks, months of working with manuscript material, where this is based primarily on secondary sources, as as large sweeping interpretations tend to be. But I've been working it in my head for years, at least since my late teens, and been stashing tidbits away, whether they were relatively obscure books or an occasional archival reference or manuscript reference I came across while working on something else. But I think what made it difficult to write, not just the scope of the thing, which is again a big departure for me. It's the first book I've written that's not about a person or a small group of people, and to me that's been the common thread in everything I've done up till this point. That the stories tended to be not as stories in the sense that they have a narrative arc, as the stories of people usually do. And instead, I'm writing a book about things that kill and maim people, which sometimes could be actually a bit difficult, even if I've spent my entire life studying weapons. So that the issue of organization, the fact that I knew it was going to be a big book, and just like with any kind of survey, I knew I was going to exclude things that bothered people. I knew I was going to include things that, especially aficionados of historic weaponry, would be perhaps annoyed by. I couldn't really think about it in those terms. I had to think about it in terms of what selection of weapons, what themes I was going to address, that made the points that I needed to make, just like with any kind of survey. So organization and what to include and what to exclude made it kind of difficult. But the reason I wrote it, and there's several reasons. First of all, it's a topic that has been, even while I'm dealing with the history of the Lutheran Church and politics in 16th century Denmark, the history of weapons has always been back there, always been an important interest. And part of that is, without going into too much detail, part of that's a family story. Even though I come from a non-gun family, my paternal grandmother, Lillian Lockhart, who was in many ways my introduction to history. She was born before the turn of the century, before the turn of the 20th century, that is. Was a mill girl in the Holyoke Chicopee area of Massachusetts, and ended up working for both Springfield Armory and then eventually for Remington at their Bridgeport, Connecticut plant. So I spent a lot of time with my grandmother when I was a kid, and her stories were always fascinating ones, but it never struck me as really weird that my grandmother could describe verbally how to disassemble and reassemble a Mosin-Nagant rifle, which might seem kind of odd, but Remington, of course, made Mosin-Nagant rifles for the Tsarist government during the First World War, so she did know it very, very well. Then I had a grandmother who had test-fired Browning machine guns, which made her about the coolest grandma I could imagine as a kid. So there was that connection there. She was my connection to history, and firearms were kind of a common link between us. And from that time, that the role of firearms in history had always interested me. So that was the initial connection, but the impetus came from maybe a slightly different direction. I wrote this book, first of all, because I had to get it out of my head. It's been bouncing around up here for decades. And second, that it became increasingly apparent to me that there was a need for a book, the kind of book I would have liked to have had, when I was much younger, that could help formally trained academic historians understand, like myself, understand not only how firearms work, but what impact they have, and not just on tactics, not just on warfare, but on not just how armies and navies fight, but also on civilization and society in a more general and a deeper way. But what finally pushed me, just a little anecdote, and I won't go into too much detail here. My department was interviewing a historian for a position that we had in modern European history, and a very, very, very good candidate, actually. But like most job candidates, we made him give a lecture to a Western Civilization survey class of introductory European history for freshmen, for first-year students. And the topic he had was the First World War, and he focused on why is the First World War so destructive? Why is it so bloody? And the rest of the lecture was excellent, but when he got to technology, it was kind of a garbled mess. It's so bloody because they had rifles that loaded in the side, and they could shoot really far, and machine guns that could fire really fast, and there are tanks and airplanes and poison gas, and hence World War I is a slaughter, particularly because the officers don't get the new technology. I mean, that's in sum total what his interpretation of the war was. And it struck me not only that the gigantic body of historical literature that has put most of that to bed, much of the traditional interpretation of the First World War to rest, that interpretation was on many levels wrong, but it was also a very accurate reflection of the way a lot of my colleagues, so a lot of professional historians, interpret the significance of combat in the First World War. And I know that's a very narrow topic right there, but given the scope of the book that I wrote, it struck me that it's not that historians don't write about weapons. They do. I mean, they're maybe not as familiar with them as they could be. They write about weapons a great deal when they're writing about, for example, the impact of the First World War or the nature of combat in the American Civil War. I mean, two areas where academic historians can't avoid talking about military technology and weapons. Weapons are frequently at the center of many arguments that are part of the basic accepted narrative we have of the history of the West. It's just that what academics know about weapons is often wrong because they don't really have the sources to turn to. And in getting those details wrong, they can build narratives that are also heavily flawed. And the Civil War and the First World War, just two examples. So what I try to do with Firepower really was two things. I wanted to make the history of weapons technology during this period accessible to a broader audience. And I know already, since I've already gotten some emails about this, that there are folks who are already quite well versed in the history of weapons, or at least of a particular kind of weapon or a particular period. And while I'm happy they read the book, I didn't initially intend the book for them, perhaps, except in the second sentence I'll get to in just a moment. But I wanted the history of weapons technology to be accessible to a broader audience, and for this broader audience to understand that the details of weapons development aren't just a matter of trivia, aren't just a matter of irrelevant, a narrative that's essentially irrelevant to our understanding of war, and towards people like this job applicant I mentioned who didn't quite get how technology fit into World War I combat and what the significance of that was. Second, and this is where to me, what ended up becoming perhaps the most important aspect of the book, although it was initially a second thought for me, was to set the details of of weapons technology, the evolution of weapons technology into a broader context. That, in this case, of general Western history. I did restrict this book to the history of the West. It was not exactly global, although there are some global implications. So, how firearms developed. Because this, although the book is subtitled How Weapons Shape Warfare, I do focus on the period roughly from the introduction of gunpowder weapons in the West to the end of the Second World War, the period where firearms really dominate, not just warfare, but they dominate research and development in military technology and weapons technology. How firearms developed, what factors drove that development, and not just the needs of the battlefield, but how do political or societal factors change the way that weapons emerge, and conversely, how the evolution of firearms technology has had a hand in shaping the Western world as we know it today. How the politics, the political institutions, how the flow of international relations has been affected by the history of weapons technology. For example, the so-called military revolution thesis that the British historian of Sweden, Michael Roberts, first brought to light in the 1950s, the notion that the introduction of gunpowder weapons is one of several factors that leads to the creation of recognizably modern, centralized states with elaborate bureaucracies fueled by the confiscated wealth of their subjects, namely taxes. How the tax state emerges in large part because of a major change in the development of military technology. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, how the development of weapons technology not only was part of the arms race that leads up to the First World War, but actually fueled that arms race. In other words, it's not just competition between the European states that accelerates the pace of technological change in weapons, but actually the pace of technological change in weapons changes the political climate of Europe leading up to the First World War. And these are just a couple of examples, but throughout, this perhaps ended up being the most important theme of the book, I think, is how weapons technology is a major part, and should be considered so, of the development of not just the modern Western state, whatever that is exactly, but almost everything, the general fabric of Western civilization well into the 20th century. And I should point out, too, the book did involve a fair amount of myth busting. And this, of course, is, I think most historians to one point or another, instead or another, like raining on other people's parades. There's some kind of pleasure that comes from that. I know I had a blast with that in Bunker Hill, with writing about Bunker Hill, for example. And here, the credit really, I'm not claiming the credit for this at all. The credit really is due to a number of historians whose work deserves a lot more attention than they've gotten, who have effectively rewritten many of the accepted narratives that we have in the history of warfare. I'm thinking, for example, with the American Civil War, scholars like Patty Griffith and Earl Hess, who have significantly revised how we understand the nature of Civil War combat and the role of technology in that combat. Earl Hess, in particular, for helping to demolish the so-called myth of the rifle musket, for example. With the First World War, scholars like Nick Lloyd, and also Patty Griffith, who the late Patty Griffith at Sandhurst, who really made a career out of raining on other people's parades. Much of the established interpretation, mainstream interpretation of First World War combat as being uniquely bloody and the result of lions led by donkeys, right? Of incompetent generals leading their men haplessly into battle, facing a military technology that was essentially unknown, and with men paying the price for it. That argument has been significantly revised and given a great deal of nuance by people like Patty Griffith and Paul Cornish and Nick Lloyd. So that was also part of it. That it's not just a matter of pointing out where weapons technology intersects with other aspects of the history of the West, but also where we've gotten the narrative wrong in the history of warfare and the history of weapons in warfare.
So, give us, if you would, a sense for those in our audience who haven't had a chance to get the book yet. Give us a sense of the narrative arc and structure of your work. You start in the 14th century, and if you go sort of book one, book two, give us a sense of the technology for each of those eras, 1300 to 1800. What was the technology and how that evolved, and then from the Age of Revolution, how that evolved, so that we can get a sense of the flow of the book.
Sure thing. And that was, as I mentioned earlier, that was one of the big challenges in writing this, was how I was going to organize it. And I ended up, before I get into the periodization of it, I ended up dividing this period into 4 large chronological chunks from 1400 to 1945, roughly 1400. I mean, it begins with the introduction of gunpowder firearms in the West. Within each of those sections, I devote time to small arms, to artillery, to navies, and very often there is something else there attached. For the early modern period, for example, for the first section, I spent a fair amount of time on fortifications. Obviously, I don't talk about air power until we get closer to the end of the book, for obvious reasons. But the periodization is basically this: the first section, the first book of the book, covers a period from roughly 1400 to 1800, and it's the biggest chronological chunk, but not the biggest chunk of the book in terms of actual page numbers. During this time, of course, we see the first gunpowder firearms. In particular, at first, the evolution of siege artillery, which spells the end of the castle as a viable means of military architecture. The rise of the artillery-based fort, of the Italian Trace fortress in particular. We see the navies made possible in a recognizably modern way. In other words, the birth of the ship-killing ship, the ship that is built around cannon and designed to destroy other ships from a distance, which is an innovation really of the very late 15th and early 16th centuries. And in small arms, a gradual introduction of what will be in its most basic form the dominant infantry arm, going well into the early 19th century. The first arquebuses and muskets. The idea being that there's not really a lot of technological change during this period. Some important technologies are arising, but the pace of one of the big themes of the book is that part of the book is that the pace of technology is quite slow. That's in part a lack of a scientific framework for understanding how weapons operate. This is before physics or chemistry, for that matter, or a modern understanding of ballistics. Also, a different attitude towards innovation, because really in the pre-industrial Europe, innovation is generally seen as a bad thing. Innovation is disruptive. Innovation is expensive. Innovation in political matters is definitely bad. And the next section, which goes from 1800 to 1870, we see that beginning to change quite a bit. The French Revolution is part of that. I mean, military historians tend to look at the French Revolution as being, really what distinguishes pre-modern from modern. In the composition of armies, some of the basic notions of the operational art, as well as the purpose of war. With Clausewitz being the prophet of a new kind of organized violence. The French Revolution doesn't have a lot of bearing on military technology. I mean, the wars of Napoleon are fought essentially with the technology of the 18th century. But the Industrial Revolution changes everything, and that's really what the second book introduces. The second book of the book introduces is the impact of the Industrial Revolution, because that brings with it not just the capacity to mass manufacture things, to equip large armies, and ultimately to be able to equip them with not only lots of weapons, but lots of ammunition and everything else that goes along with all the materials of war. But also a different attitude towards innovation, namely that innovation can be profitable, that innovation is generally a good thing, and a different way of getting, a different process of getting ideas from the head of an inventor. I mean, the inventor really is a creation, after all, the industrial age, into the hands of the soldier. And here we begin to see already, the beginnings of the military-industrial complex, as long before Eisenhower talked about it, as governments take a much more assertive role in manufacturing, as professional soldiers get more involved in the designing and the testing of weapons, and as academics become involved, as things like physics and chemistry become academic pursuits, they become actual disciplines. But the fruit of that, although we see many of the harbingers of a new way of war already before 1870, ironclad warships, for example, repeating rifles, the earliest submarine or at least submersible vessels. It's really in the period 1870 to 1918, which is the next chunk of the book, and the biggest chunk and my favorite one. Even though I'm an early modernist at heart, even though my heart's always in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was that period 1870 to 1918 that I found the most fun to work with, because that industrialization was beginning to change the pace of innovation. And we really, where it comes to firearms, we don't see a period that year for year is as fertile, as fecund as that period from that half a century preceding the First World War. The evolution of small arms during that period is so much faster than anything preceded it, and really faster than anything that comes after it, for that matter. So that by the time we get to 1914, the killing potential of all weapons has been increased dramatically, and we're beginning to see some emerging technologies in the First World War that may not have entirely proven their worth, armor being a great example. It takes a really imaginative man, a person in 1918, to say that tanks have a future. And yet there are some imaginative people who do exactly that. But air power is already, although still very much in its infancy, has proven its utility in the First World War. And so the fourth section of the book, which deals with the period from the end of the First World War to the end of the Second, is in ways kind of an epilogue, as we see a number of those technologies introduced in the previous half century to come to maturity. Air power, in particular, in the First World War, and the Second World War. Armor in the Second World War. More portable firepower in the form of, for example, submachine guns, light machine guns, and ultimately the predecessors of what we call, for better for worse, the assault rifle, and then some retrograde motion in other ways. That the pinnacle of naval architecture in the period up to the First World War is the super dreadnought. The all big gun battleship, heavily armored. And in the Second World War, as impressive as the all big gun ships are, and though they prove themselves to have some utility, clearly, where the interesting stuff is happening at sea is really centered more around the aircraft carrier and the submarine than it does around the battleship. So that's how I did the periodization. And I ended in 1945. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. My smart ass answer to that is, after 1945, I'm just done. Right? I mean, I have a hard time thinking of things after 1945 as history. That's just me. As a kid, I used to say that I had a hard time thinking of World War II as history because my dad was in it, and I couldn't imagine my dad, being part of history. But the reason I end with 1945 is not that firearms go away. Of course they don't. Of course small arms development is still a critical issue in the development of military technology. It's just that firearms are no longer necessarily the dominant focal point tactics or of the development of military technology, and that the focus of research and development in weapons technology is moved primarily into other areas. And so to me, it's that period roughly from the Renaissance to 1945 that I had originally had in the subtitle of the book, Firepower, How Weapons Changed Warfare in the Age of the Gun. The age of the gun being the term I use to refer to that, roughly almost 500-year period.
So I'm going to ask a few questions here, but I want to make sure that the audience knows that you're welcome to ask questions as well. Just use the chat feature on the bottom of your screen where it says chat to send those questions. Those questions will come to me, and I will ask Paul. Paul, what's important? What is important for historians to really understand in terms of the function and the effectiveness of weapons in their work?
I think it's important simply because, as I mentioned earlier, weapons end up being central to a lot of narratives that historians who don't consider themselves military historians still deal with, on a regular basis. I've a good friend, for example, who's the focal point of her research really is the long-term effect of the First World War on British culture, and her assumptions about the First World War, that it is a slaughter. That is the First World War of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. In other words, more than it is the First World War that we see if we focus primarily on actual operations. That a lot of her assumptions about the actual physical context of the First World War were misplaced. In other words, again, getting the details wrong leads to narratives being incorrect. There was a recent, and I won't name the author, but there was a recent piece, I believe it was in the New Yorker, I can't remember exactly, a few years ago, during the First World War centennial, that revived the old J. Louvas argument about the military legacy of the Civil War. Namely, the First World War is so bloody because Europeans didn't pay attention to trench warfare at the end of the American Civil War and the mismatch of technology and tactics. And hence, we get the Somme. Hence, we get Verdun. We get this bloodiness in the First World War because Europeans didn't understand the lessons of the Civil War. And it's just demonstrably wrong argument. Europeans had plenty of examples of trench warfare and modern technology without having to pay attention to the Civil War. But this big argument, very attractive argument, was based on essentially a flawed understanding of military technology. It's just that the historians and more historians I've talked to find this kind of not off-putting. They're actually fascinated with the notion that maybe the bigger narrative isn't exactly what they thought it was. That although there is clearly a certain amount of, I want to say, repugnance, academics generally aren't gun people. I mean, that's part of it. And academics tend to skew left politically, and that usually doesn't go along with gun ownership or with familiarity with firearms. But that doesn't seem to be the motivating factor here. But that lack of familiarity with firearms, very often in the past, at least, historians have kind of dismissed it. Well, that's trivia. That's for gun buffs. That's for war gamers. And without understanding that the implications of not understanding that technology are just as big as the implications of not understanding how farming works. If you're dealing with economic history.
Wow. So our next question comes from one of our members of our guest, who's a friend of mine, a fellow member of the Sons of the American Revolution. I'm going to bring Brooks Lyles into the conversation here, and he's got a question for you, Paul.
Okay.
Welcome.
All right, Paul.
Yes.
I'm a retired Army officer, and I used to teach at Command and General Staff College. And one of the things that we used to study were what we referred to as revolutions in military affairs.
Yes.
So, and examples would be the introduction of gunpowder, the introduction of the rifled musket, the introduction of steam-powered warships, military aircraft, as you referenced in your discussions there. What would be the one big thing, the RMA that changed how we view warfare in the period of the American Revolution?
Period of the American Revolution. Again, and this is purely a personal perspective, I would argue it's the if there is anything that is revolutionary in the conduct of war, at least on land, is the what a friend of mine once referred to as the light infantry revolution. How European armies began to adopt light infantry tactics, which we often dismiss. I mean, American military historians in particular, looking at the British Army as being singularly clumsy in wilderness fighting, when there probably wasn't an army that was better adapted to irregular warfare than the British were, thanks to their experience in the Scottish Highlands and also during the French and Indian War. But that's to me, that's the big tactical change. There's no really significant technological changes during that period, I would argue, at least, except perhaps and it's not really realized until the Napoleonic age, the increased viability of field artillery, which of course has a huge impact on, no pun intended, I guess, maybe pun fully intended, on land battle, as evidenced in for example, the growth of the Prussian artillery arm during the late 18th century. But still, even then, we don't really see the fruits of that until the Napoleonic age, which isn't very long afterwards. But yeah, to me, that time of the American Revolution really is the in my perspective at least, the move of European armies towards light infantry and towards adaptability for fighting irregular wars.
I mean, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yeah, isn't it the case? Question. Isn't it the case that during the American Revolution, you talk about the use of the light infantry, just in terms of what we read in the history books, that the provincials learned to fight in the Indian way during the American Revolution, and there was really sort of a transformation in both the British forces and the Hessian auxiliaries came to America had to adapt and learn how to fight the American colonists in that way, or was that already happening?
Well, I would argue, first of all, the British light infantry tradition is already well established before the American Revolution. It's established in the 45 uprising. It's definitely established during the 7 Years' War, and some of the key British commanders in the Revolution are themselves light infantrymen. William Howe, I mean, probably one of the best examples. Howe was an early advocate of light infantry. He was probably the pioneer, the most vocal pioneer of light infantry tactics and irregular tactics in Britain, like during the Salisbury Plains exercises before the Revolution. And Gage, Thomas Gage's light infantry was a light infantry advocate after Braddock's defeat. So the British already had a tradition of wilderness fighting that predated the American Revolution, which has always bothered me. That popular notion that the British come to North America in 1775 and they're befuddled by the existence of trees and hills, as if they've been fighting all their wars on parking lots and tennis courts in Europe. But no, the British have already adapted, and Hessian auxiliaries, a good number of them at least, already had made significant significant use of Feldjäger, of essentially professional huntsmen turned into light infantry. So no, I think this predates the Revolution, and where it comes to the American experience, for example, in the French and Indian War, I think very often that is, I saw for example at Bunker Hill how that was very often overstated, that Americans who had served in provincial regiments in the French and Indian War were more often doing things like guarding supplies at Crown Point than they were actually engaging in combat. And it were British troops who were doing the bulk of the combat, outside of a few exceptional units like Rogers Rangers. So no, the British have a couple of real strengths at the beginning of the Revolution. One of them is an aptitude for amphibious warfare, and the other is I think a pretty well-grounded understanding of how one fights a war in the wilderness.
So historians have long assumed that the two modern wars in particular, the American Civil War and its successor, trench warfare, the First World War, were uniquely bloody, and that the carnage stemmed from the new weapons technology and the failure of military leaders to adapt to those new technologies. And in reading Firepower, you express some skepticism of this viewpoint. Tell me about that.
Well, let's start with the American Civil War, which is probably the easiest one to dispense with. Part of it comes from, there's an American exceptionalist school of military history, which has been around for a very long time, which oftentimes doesn't see American wars within their broader Western context. For example, I don't think there was a lot of American Civil War history written in the 50s and 60s that understood the tactical context of the Crimean War, the Franco-Austrian War in 1859. But where it comes to the Civil War, first of all, the unique bloodiness. It's very often stated that there's more casualties in the American Civil War than there are in all American wars combined. Well, a couple issues with that statistically. When you count both sides of both federal and Confederate, you're going to have somewhat exaggerated casualty statistics. But also, let's face it, American wars before the American Civil War are puny. By European standards, they're tiny. Even a revolution involves, relatively small forces fighting relatively small battles compared to, for example, European battles during the 7 Years' War. But if you look at proportional casualties, in other words, a proportion of an army in any particular given fight, and it's relatively easy to compare because battles tend to be discrete events that last a day or maybe a couple of days. That battle casualties are, in the American Civil War, are not significantly different than battle casualties in the 7 Years' War, more than a century before, and which is infuriating when you look at earlier interpretations of the 7 Years' War. We talk about European forces that are practically dancing pirouettes around one another and not actually engaging in real combat. 18th century combat's bloody. So my point is here, the technology doesn't make much of a difference. The casualty rates are roughly the same. Now, where it comes to the rifle musket, and Earl Hess did a great book on this. There are a few things I disagree with him on it, but overall, wonderful book, where he pointed out, much as Paddy Griffith tried to do before him, that the rifle musket does have significant ballistic advantages over smoothbore muskets that preceded it. But those advantages don't matter much when you're not trained how to use them. That the increased range, for example, and accuracy don't matter much if you don't actually know how to aim. And with the lack of marksmanship training in both armies during the war, as Paddy Griffith pointed out, it's practically a non-factor. On top of that, the parabolic trajectory of the rifle musket bullet, which means that there are significant safe zones between the shooter and the target, especially at medium ranges. And in particular, to me, the really damning thing here is the assumption that the American Civil War sees the first massive use of rifle muskets. We see that because we see a little bit in the Crimean War. We see a lot in the Franco-Austrian War, where the Austrian army is almost exclusively armed with the Lorenz rifle musket. And guess what? The French assault Austrian positions time after time, and they manage to take them with the bayonet. Because the French understood how you get around the technology. You move fast, you don't stop to shoot back, you don't have your soldiers drop to the ground at 80 yards and shoot back at the enemy, you keep pushing on. And the casualty rates will be significant, but the French were taking positions with the bayonet. We don't see the same thing in the American Civil War because, let's face it, American Civil War soldiers are not trained the same way that French professional soldiers are in the 1850s. They don't They aren't able to execute French tactics the way they were meant. And the one occasion where we see them in a big way in the American Civil War, Emory Upton's assault at Spotsylvania in May of 1864, it's a success. It isn't followed up, but Emory Upton essentially employed the same kind of tactics the French did, and it worked. So my point with the American Civil War is, yes, there's some new technologies, but the casualty rates are essentially the same as they were in previous wars. And the rifle musket, as much attention as it gets as this merciless reaper of lives, doesn't have a demonstrable impact on casualty rates. And as the French proved in 1859, it's possible to circumvent what the advantages of the rifle musket are. So that's, the Civil War. There's a whole slew of things like that. I'm sorry, Roger, you.
Well, so I mean, taking a different turn on that, we have another question from one of my SAR compatriots, Pastor Dwight Elam from the Florida Society, asks, did the development of the technology during a war actually change the final result of any war?
Of any war, not talking about specifically the Civil War?
Right, correct.
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure, I'm probably missing something. Nothing pops to mind. Mostly because it seems that in most wars, the pace of technological development slows somewhat. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there are not lots of ideas. I mean, the American Civil War is a great example of thousands upon thousands of patents for new weapons that are issued during the American Civil War, but relatively few of them actually, of course, make it into production.
I suppose it's easy to say that that certain technological changes may have shortened a war. I mean, after all, the atomic bomb certainly.
Oh yeah, well,
certainly shortened the war.
Okay.
But did it really change the result of the war?
Right.
Right. We don't know.
Shortened it, but I can shorten it.
Yeah. The fact that, and I guess if you can look on a grander scale, I would argue that America's ability to ramp up production the way they did in World War II, that certainly changed. That probably changed the result.
Oh yeah, and in fact, one of the big points I try to make, especially in the third and fourth sections of the book, is that the Industrial Revolution not only does those changes that I mentioned before, like changing the nature of innovation and the process by which innovation becomes reality, becomes a combat weapon, is that the Industrial Revolution also shrinks the number of states that can actually act as great powers.
Yeah.
And that they can afford to not only produce them in mass, but to change them on a regular basis, like this, the rifle race between France and Germany between 1871 and 1914 is a good example. You have to be willing to commit a great deal of wastage to keep up with modern technology. But with the Second World War, it's not just that, but also the ability to manufacture gigantic quantities. Because, I mean, relatively few aficionados of armor would claim that that Americans had the superior armor designs of the Second World War. They clearly don't. And I like Sherman, for example. But for that matter, there's a Soviet tank design. While the T-34, of course, is a revolutionary tank, is less sophisticated overall than German tank design. But both the Americans and the Soviets had the capacity, certainly by the middle of the Second World War, to just keep producing stuff, more and more and more and more of it. And the Germans did not have that ability, or they lost that ability, if they ever did have it. So yeah, in that sense. Not in the sense of the technological development of individual weapons or weapon systems, but just simply the productive capacity to manufacture war material ends up being certainly a hugely decisive factor in the Second World War.
So, getting very specific here, in firepower, you point to technology around the year 1870. Tell us what happened in 1870. Why is that so pivotal in weapons and war history?
Well, a number of things come together at once, some of which have been in development for a while, but one of them, of course, is the introduction, which has been coming for a while, the introduction of one of the most important innovations in the history of handheld firearms, namely the self-contained metal-cased, internally primed cartridge. First pin fire, then rim fire, and of course center fire cartridges are quite common by 1870, and most European states and the United States are moving towards adopting them. Which means that the age of the rifle musket is over, and any army worth anything has already adopted breech-loading single-shot rifles. So that's a major technological step that allows a lot of other technologies to follow, including the introduction of repeating rifles in mass. And of course, we have them during the American Civil War, but in larger quantities and better designed for the rigors of military service. On top of that, the maturation of the factory system and political motivation, and the real core here of political motivation for military innovation comes from, and without getting, it sounds very specific, but it comes from the deteriorating relationship between France and Germany. With the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-1871, France has not only suffered a humiliating defeat, because almost any military figure would have told you in 1870 the best army in Europe was France's. That a humiliating defeat and the loss of Alsace and Lorraine contributes to a climate in which hatred of Germany as the author of France's woes becomes common. And with France's unstable political situation after 1871, the Third Republic notoriously unstable, that casting of blame on Germany became very attractive. And conversely, Bismarck and German leadership feared France not because they wanted a war, but because they were convinced that if France ever got the drop on Germany, that France would act. And so that very toxic political relationship between those two, which bleeds into European international relations in general, fuels not only a race to build bigger armies and more weapons, but better weapons. And so that military industrial complex that we see early on in the Industrial Revolution really intensifies. So by the 1870s, 1880s, the French and the German governments are putting together design teams that consist of professional soldiers, industrialists, engineers, and academics to solve specific problems. To me, again, one of the more important issues in industrialization here is that there's intentional innovation, not just, hey, that's a cool idea, let's make a weapon out of it, but rather we want to have a rifle powder that's smokeless and produces a higher velocity than black powder. We want to have an artillery piece that whose position is not affected by recoil, where recoil is suppressed. Specific engineering problems now become huge priorities for not just European armies, but European governments. So 1870 is kind of the beginning of that. And that relationship that condition just gets more intense as we go towards the First World War. And it's also part of a broader trend that I think most historians recognize about the late 19th century, which is the drift towards militarism. And here I mean militarism in a way that historians mean it, which is that the military becomes the leading priority of European governments. So the needs of the Army and the Navy come first. And that attitude, that willingness to spend all sorts of social capital, as well as vast amounts of resources to advance military technology, even when it means loss of wastage, comes from really that critical year there, 1870, 1871.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to finish with this. Jeremy Black, renowned historian Jeremy Black, who's written a billion books. He seems to write a book every 3 months. Writes extensively about geopolitics of warfare. What if your book had been called Firepower: How Weapons Shaped Geopolitics? You've been making references to the military industrial complex. You were just talking about how Western nations, all nations, expend so much of their capital on weaponry. Weapons as a commodity, and are we as a nation, we put a lot of our own money into the military. We put a lot of our own money into weapon systems.
Huge amounts, yeah.
Yeah, and is this just what humankind is all about now? Is what's in the future?
That one I'm a bad prognosticator, but yeah, that seems to be, it's a pretty common theme, and even if you're going back before 1870, even back to the time of the military revolution, of Michael Roberts' military revolution, in other words, 16th and 17th centuries, you could make the argument, like German historians were making back in the 20s and the 30s, is that the modern state as it emerges in the 16th and 17th centuries is essentially exists to make war, to prepare for war. That the bureaucratic structures are there to mobilize resources for the making of war. And there's a lot to be said for that argument. The concern isn't raising taxes in order to provide a social safety net. I mean, nobody's thinking in those directions in the 1600s, but rather using taxes to fund fleets, to build fortifications, and to be ready to raise armies for war when necessary. And so that's that's the same thing, I think, in perhaps a more abstract way. But it seems almost in Western history that really from the beginning of centralized bureaucratic tax-fueled states, that's the intent, that government exists first and foremost to be ready for war, which is kind of a disturbing thing.
Well, all things being said, while I am a military historian, a public historian, I'm not at all knowledgeable about weaponry. I learned so much from reading Paul Lockhart's Firepower and How Weapons Shape War, not only about the weaponry itself, but so much about the wars themselves and the effect. So I congratulate you on this work, Paul, and I thank you for joining us this evening. As we close out here, I wanted to let you all know that on Tuesday, November 30th, doing something a little different, I've invited one of my authors who's written a book for middle graders called Links to Liberty. This is the third book in a series, American Revolutionary War Adventure series, and I'm asking Rob Skeed to tell us about his book, Links to Liberty, which is an adventure story about how two twin boys, help the Army with the chain across West Point. And this is the third book in the series, and we're going to talk about teaching history to kids. What motivates kids? What can bring kids into learning about history, and why that is important. And of course, we've all read the headlines. We know that this is an important topic. So I'm looking forward to that show. Then on December 7th, I have Woody Holton from the University of South Carolina, who has written a new book called Liberty is Sweet: The Hidden History of the American Revolution. A lot of controversy about Woody that's going on, again, straight from the headlines. Woody is a big supporter of the 1619 Project, but he's written a very important book on the American Revolution, and there's a lot in his book that you haven't read in many other books that makes it very, very worthwhile. On January 11th, I have my friend Cole Jones from Purdue, who's written a book, Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War, and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution. And then on January 18th, I have Don Hagest, who's written These Distinguished Corps. We were talking earlier about the light infantry in the British Army. This is These Distinguished Corps is about the British Grenadier and the light infantry battalions in the American Revolution. So we've got some terrific shows coming up, and I hope you will continue to join us. On December 11th, I'm hosting live here in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, an author talk with Patrick K. O'Donnell, whose new book, The Indispensables, about the Marblehead Regiment in the American Revolution, is going to be joining us. And you can find more information about that on the History Author Talks website. So again, Paul, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Roger.
And as always, to all of my guests, or all of my audience, I love having you folks join me. As always, I will be posting this video on the past shows tab at History Author Talks, so that you can let let other folks know about it. And with that, I'll say good night. Take care, everybody.